there is less poverty causing anxiety than there was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But what happens is that we now have this thing called status anxiety, which is you find in countries where there is income inequality. And we're talking about countries like the UK and the USA in particular that have rather large income inequalities. And people become anxious about their position in economic hierarchies these days.
I'm super excited to talk to you. I came across your article that says that the things we consume, for example, television news, has a psychological impact on us. I think a lot of people haven't made those connections.
No, absolutely. And over the last 20 years, news has become more emotional. It's become more graphic in the ways that it's presented. And of course, the obvious thing is that it's become more, you can get the news every day. We have alerts on our phones telling us what's happening in the world, so it becomes immediate. And of course, I think what a lot of people are becoming aware of is the fact that that affects your mood. You may not notice it initially, but I think, I'm trying to remember the figures now, but I think something like 50 to 60% of all news is genuinely negative in the information it's imparting. So it's about things like illness, poverty, conflict, violence, divisive politics as well, which we've got in the last 5 years or so. All of that is negative, and it changes your mood. And your mood becomes more negative. You become a little bit more anxious, a little bit more sad. You may not notice it immediately, but that has other effects on you as well. And one of those effects is it makes you think more about your own problems. Believe it or not, it exacerbates your own worries, that kind of thing. So it's that kind of news has become more emotional, it's become more negative, that affects your mood, and your mood affects the way that you think about your own life.
I can imagine what impact that has on us personally, because it will affect how you engage with the people around you, how you parent, your intimate relationships, all of that, right?
Yeah, everything that you yourself feel concerned about will be made more concerning by watching negative news, even though the content of that news may not be particularly relevant to your own concerns, because it's the way it changes your overall mood that makes things different.
Right. I think for me, what it does is it highlights sometimes even countries that you don't know anyone in those countries, but it kind of is. It makes you feel like the world is getting much worse, and it's a darker place, and then it makes you worry about the future for your children. What kind of world are they inheriting? Like even with the climate, how we talk about the climate issue in the news, it's almost apocalyptic.
No, absolutely. And the two of the factors that I talked about a little earlier have exacerbated these effects. One is the fact that we get news all the time now. 20 years ago, there used to be a news slot at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock on the TV. And we used to get our news then, and that was it. But now it's around us all the time.
Right.
And what's equally interesting is it's become very visual. If there's a terrorist attack, or if there's a natural disaster like an earthquake, we immediately get visual videos, we get pictures from people who are actually experiencing that event now.
Yes.
And so it becomes incredibly real to us. And the more real it becomes to us, the more likely we are to think that that is going to happen to us as well,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
You're reminding me, actually. I once I was on holiday one time, a few years ago, I went to LA on holiday, and their news there actually has like production values that you would see in a Hollywood film. So I turned it on and I was getting ready to go out to go to the beach. And it just said predator on the loose in Long Beach. And then it cuts off and there's music, almost like horror film music, really dramatic. And it made me want to not go to the beach.
Yes, yeah. That's a good example of modern day news being sensationalized. And over the last 20, 30 years, since news lost its slot at whatever time it was in the evening,
Yeah.
it's had to compete with other programs, with entertainment, with
Yeah.
other news programs. So every news bulletin has to compete. And to compete, journalists will often use sensationalization to make sure we're the news that you should be watching.
Yeah. I remember when I was growing up, I grew up watching, Christian Amanpour, and they could be reporting with tanks firing behind them, but they were so composed that you always ask yourself, how are they able to do that? But you could see that that was a skill that they had to develop because they needed to get the message across and maintain a level of professionalism. But now what you notice is a lot of the news anchors, they almost have to be actors and display the emotion. If they're talking about a particularly divisive subject, they need to show the anger. And if it's something that we should be feeling resentful about, they show us, they act it out.
Yes, absolutely. Very much so. And another example of that kind of thing is, a journalist will very often leave us at the end of a particular bulletin or a particular story with they'll leave us with something, and that will usually be something like the worst case scenario.
Right.
Usually. And we've certainly seen that during the COVID pandemic. Very often, when people are talking about how much the virus has spread, the story will end with a kind of, oh, but this could be even worse type message.
Right.
And again, that just hypes up the sensationalism, basically. And, I always remember, which is an old saying in journalism, which is basically, no journalist wants to be boring. And of course, one way of getting around that is to make sure you pick out the most sensationalized aspects of the story and highlight them, especially at the end.
That's so interesting you say that, because I think it was the opposite for me. I always dreamed of being a journalist, and I finally got the opportunity in 2012. I had an opportunity to work in the newsroom at Channel 4 News, and I realized within a matter of weeks that I couldn't be a normal journalist, because it was a kidnapping, or there was a story about a kidnapping of a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, and I panicked so much. I started just inwardly praying and hoping this child would be found. But for the journalist, you have to almost, if the child is found, there's no story for you. And I realized with every disaster, I will be the one hoping it doesn't happen. And how can you succeed when you're hoping every story kind of goes away?
Yes, absolutely. you know, and again, it's a common part of journalism that you know, if something sensational happens, every journalist wants to be there, and it's so sad. But it's the one reality of all this is the fact that most news that consumers are interested in tends to be negative news. It's something bad happening.
I think a lot of us don't recognize that we are driving that, that it's almost a symbiotic relationship, that we are the ones who consume the content, and so we get more of the content that we consume. What is it about us that needs that negative news? You want to see the failed marriage, you know, the happy relationships, whether they're celebrities or public figures, those ones aren't news for some reason.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a bit to do with the way the human brain is. Attention is grabbed much more by negative events than it is by positive events. So it's your attention will be grabbed by threats and challenges and things that you think might be threats and challenges, rather than positive things. And those threats and challenges will cause usually an immediate emotional change that you won't be consciously aware of, and that will imprint that attentional change in your brain, in the sense that you're much more likely to attend to that kind of thing again. And of course, the whole point about that, from an evolutionary point of view, is it's much, much more important and urgent to be aware of negative, threatening challenges because of your survival, you know. So that's just it's just the way the brain is wired,
right?
From an evolutionary point of view, that people attend more to negative stories than they do to positive stories.
You say from an evolutionary point of view, but don't you think we need to do the opposite now to evolve? Because isn't it harming us when we're constantly operating from that way of thinking, of thinking that actually we need to be paying attention to those threats, because those threats aren't the real threats anymore, aren't the real threats, living in negative states, so that it's that we're actually disintegrating our own lives. So you consume negative news and then you're in a bad mood that then doesn't allow you to thrive at work, doesn't allow you to have a great relationship with your children or your partner.
Most people will survive. That's the interesting thing about anxiety. It's in many ways it's a positive emotion, in that it helps you survive through threats and challenges by making you consciously aware of them. Now, anxiety is not necessarily a pleasant emotion to experience, but that doesn't matter as far as evolution's concerned. What matters is that it helps you as a living organism to survive. And there are a few studies, and very interesting little studies, that have suggested that anxious people are significantly less likely to die an accidental death before the age of 25, for example. And their anxiety keeps them focused on all the threats and challenges around them. It may be not the best way to live, but you're going to survive, and that's all that evolution and worries about, if you like.
You say that anxiety is an epidemic that's significant enough to challenge the dominance of depression. Can you explain the difference between anxiety and depression for people who aren't familiar with the clinical differences?
Yeah, a simple way to do it is to say that anxiety is an emotion that's evolved to help us deal with threats and challenges.
Right.
Depression is an emotion which we have that helps us, or tries to help us, deal with losses and failures. So those kinds of events are different. Losses and failures usually result in depression, and threats and challenges usually result in anxiety. Now, anxiety is very much a kind of gearing you up type of emotion. It increases your physical reactivity to things. It makes your brain attend more to negative things that are happening. Depression is very quite opposite to that. Depression is something where you lose interest in stuff. You may feel sleepy all the time, or in some cases unable to sleep, for example. And depression also makes you feel very bad about yourself.
Right.
Now, anxiety doesn't necessarily do that. We all know, for example, that warriors, which is the fourth part of anxiety, warriors, for example, are very proud of being warriors. They tell everybody they're warriors. They're not, that's them, that defines them. My mother will always say, I'm a born warrior. And I say, Mother, there's no such thing as a born warrior. People make themselves warriors, and they're very proud of being warriors because they think it's a positive attribute. Whereas with depression makes you feel very bad about yourself. It lowers your self-esteem. It makes you feel bad about the world, and that the world's a very threatening place generally.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you feel that you don't have a particularly good future.
Right.
And in extreme cases, of course, it leads to people wanting to take their own lives because of that feeling, which is, extremely problematic.
I know it's a simple question, but what causes depression? I think for a lot of people, it almost feels like too much attention is paid to the causes of depression that are biological, that maybe you inherited this type of brain that it leads you to be depressed. But what are the things that can help us, exercise our own agency to avoid getting depressed?
Yeah, again, I think it's important to be aware that there is a genetic component to both depression and anxiety, but it's not huge. Not huge. You will inherit, a tendency towards depression or towards anxiety from your parents, but it won't. It's not genetic in the sense that it's the primary cause of your anxiety.
Right.
Your anxiety and your depression will then come out of your own experiences with the world, but you may inherit a tendency to become depressed. And I think
if you inherited the blueprint, does that then cause you to almost be constantly reacting in a way that means that you'll be depressed?
No, I don't think so. No, I think that interacts with some quite extreme life events that people may have, experiencing losses and failures, for example, in their life. If it's a big event, getting sacked or made redundant from your job, you're losing your income. If it's something like losing a loved one at an important time in your life, big events like that may interact with a kind of inherited tendency.
Right.
But I don't think there's a lot of evidence to say that these things cannot be changed. I think most of the evidence suggests that we now do have a lot of ways in which we can help people who are depressed and anxious.
Book, The Anxiety Epidemic. You write that it's lifestyle changes that have led to the stress and pressure that's placed on us from childhood through to adulthood.
Yeah.
what are the differences in modern life compared to, because you look back, you know, our ancestors survived wars.
Yeah.
Why are we more anxious?
Gosh, yeah, and I think that's an interesting question. And when I was researching this, it was difficult to find, you know, genuine differences between what was going on in 500,000 years ago and what's been going on today. But there are subtle differences, and they're interesting ones. I mean, the kinds of things that used to make our ancestors anxious are things like poverty, health, employment, and so on, a conflict, all of those kinds of things. And they're still the same, but they're in different kinds of forms. A couple of things that I can try and give you a couple of examples of how those things have changed a bit. If we look at poverty, there's less poverty in the world today than there was 500 years ago, let's say. But even westernized countries still have poverty.
Yeah.
There is less poverty causing anxiety than there was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. But what happens is we now have this thing called status anxiety, which is you find in countries where there is income inequality. And we're talking about countries like the UK and the USA in particular that have rather large income inequalities. And people become anxious about their position in economic hierarchies these days, what kind of job they can have and so on. The other issue, the other example is health, I think, where there's plenty of research which says that people who have disabilities and poor health are more anxious than people who don't. I mean, and that's understandable. That's common sense makes us believe that that would be the case.
Right.
But of course, medical science has actually enabled us to help people recover from many health problems, and it's increased longevity. People are living much longer. But one consequence of that is that people are living much longer, much longer with disabilities. And the obvious example there is dementia. Many more people are getting dementia simply because they're not dying earlier from other health problems. And if you look at the figures over the last 10 years or 20 years, you see that the number of people with disabilities who are suffering anxiety is increasing year on year because they're living longer. And that has a knock-on effect as well, because they have to be cared for. And the people who care for them are usually friends and relatives who are healthy, but have to do that job 24/7. And it's fairly clear that they are becoming stressed by that as well. So if you look at the global health issue, it's actually getting worse when, from an anxiety and stress point of view. But we would like to think, of course, that because of medical science, it's getting better, but it doesn't appear to be. So it's something like that.
I have to say, I hadn't even thought of that. That doesn't really, I've never read that. It's not something I've come across. Do you think we are dissociated from the ways in which our mental health and our physical health are connected?
Yeah, I think they tend to be connected anyway, but whether we're aware of it, I'm not so sure. We certainly know when we're stressed, but we very often won't know what it is that's stressing us.
Yeah.
It's often very hard to do that. And we started this interview talking about news, which can stress you out. You may feel stressed sometimes, but you may not connect it to the news. All you know is you're stressed. and that's significant thing for you. Yeah.
Right. You talked about anxiety, status anxiety. Can you explain what is it? How do we develop status anxiety?
I don't think any of us know really, but it's inherent in most societies and most cultures. It's inherent that you want to try and do best for yourself and your family, because you want your family to survive. And if we take that down to the evolutionary level, your genes will want you and your family to survive because that's the way they are. And so if you can get up that ladder, that economic and social ladder, you're making it safer and better for your children and your genes to survive.
I used to think that, but I'm wondering more if that actually isn't the case, because I know a lot of people who, are really wealthy, not just the ones I know, but also the ones you read about, who are almost more anxious, and their children aren't also less able, the children also seem to be less able to adapt. I mean, they talk about this, the children who, protesting, and how let down the generation of young people who are university graduates feel, because they felt that, that life would become a certain way. So it must be something in our culture that is making people to grow up to be aware of status, and causing us to be anxious. Because even looking at school plays and the way children are rewarded in class, already it's like competition is constantly encouraged. And so if that's inbuilt from a young age, how can it not lead to status anxiety when you grow older?
Yeah, well, it does, and I, throughout this interview, I keep popping into the conversation the fact that anxiety is not a particularly nice emotion to experience, but it's beneficial from a survival point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
So how do we cope with it?
How do we cope with it? Well, most of us adapt very quickly. I can use the COVID pandemic as an example here.
Okay.
Studies that I've seen have shown that when the first lockdown came in the UK, anxiety levels went up dramatically in the generally across the population, not in people, generally across the population. As far as I could see from those studies, it lasted a week. It lasted a week. And then second, third week into lockdown, these levels were back to pre-lockdown levels of anxiety. So people had adapted very quickly. And I think that's important to remember. Anxiety can help you get through the worst bit. It makes your brain think about, okay, how am I going to cope with this? What am I going to do? How do I deal with these problems that are coming at me like this? But most people can. It's only the people that don't have those coping skills.
Yes.
Well, not just them, but the people that don't have those coping skills can't see a way out of what's happening, and can't project themselves forward in that way, are the people that are going to suffer very severe anxiety problems. But the majority of people can adapt. And I think that's important to remember. Anxiety, I keep saying this, anxiety is not a bad emotion. It's there to help you. But if you have problems in adapting when you're feeling anxious, then that's when the problems start.
So what you're saying is, one, it's hardwired into us, anxiety is, and two, labeling it as a negative thing, just in binary terms, is not helpful. In fact, that is likely to just cause us to feel even more stress. So the way to see anxiety is, it has a purpose, it helps us to survive, and then knowing that, develop coping skills, future cast yourself, and think of how it is that you're going to be able to adapt in different situations. Right.
Absolutely, absolutely. Most therapeutic interventions for anxiety problems involve helping people to learn how to problem solve. And of course, that's important, because if you can problem solve, in your head, the things that are the threats and challenges to you become less threatening and less challenging, because, I know if this happens, I can do this, or I can do that, or that's the way out of it. And that's important. Again, we know that most people know that anxiety is useful in certain situations. If you're just about to do an interview, then it's good to get a little bit anxious about it, because it focuses you on what you're doing. My book's called The Anxiety Epidemic, but I should perhaps own up and be honest here. It's hard to find good evidence that there is a genuine epidemic. What is at epidemic proportions is, over the last 10 years, the numbers of people that have been seeking help for anxiety-based problems over the last 10, 20 years. And it's increased in the last 5 years enormously. And that's just people seeking help for anxiety-based problems. I even did a study at our own university, at the University of Sussex, and on undergraduate students, and I had 20 years worth of data on how severe their worrying was. And from the year 2000 until this year, their levels of worrying, the frequency with which they worry, has gone up by 20% over that time, in a straight line. No one event over those years has suddenly increased it. It's just slowly got worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's very true of young people. Their anxiety levels have certainly got higher. But what we don't know is whether young people have always been anxious like that, or whether they've just become more aware of the symptoms of anxiety and can now label it as anxiety. And that may be why more people are seeking help and treatment for anxiety, is that they're more aware of these symptoms than they were 20 years ago.
So they're seeking treatment. Do you think there's a lot of people who think they have an anxiety disorder, but really are just, it's a low-level anxiety that they probably could have dealt with if they had the tools, but they see it as much worse and then get help? Do you think there's an exaggeration?
I hesitate to call it an exaggeration. I think anxiety is not a pleasant, emotion to experience, but we mustn't pathologize anxiety. It's not nice, but it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, and that's important to understand. I think a lot of people have kind of almost become thinking about, they want their lives to be perfect, and that means not having any negative emotions in your life at all. Now, that is never going to be the case. You will always have them there.
And so do you think that's coming from popular psychology?
I think that's coming from social media.
All right.
to be honest, not necessarily popular psychology.
Yeah.
Let's talk about social media for a minute in the
Yes,
context of
please.
anxiety, because I think it's one of the big modern day contributors to anxiety, which our predecessors and ancestors didn't have to experience.
Right.
It's basically perpetual connectivity.
Right.
The
Yes.
internet now allows us, and we've talked about news. You
Yes.
get news every minute of the day
Yeah.
through the internet connections and smartphones. And the same is true of social media in the sense you're in constant connection with your friends the whole time, but not physically. You're not there seeing them, touching them. And Facebook calls them friends, but are they friends? They're just people that you're linked with. And interestingly, young people in particular have become they've become basically people who index their popularity by the number of friends they have on Facebook, for instance, and that's a pressure in itself,
Yes.
because everybody can see how many friends you have on Facebook, and so it's a striving to have more friends. But what it means is, I think, that young people, especially, have fewer true confidants who they're willing to talk openly with.
Yeah.
You really have to kind of be physically with those people who become confidants, and you can't do it easily over social media.
No.
And of course, the main thing, going back to this idea about perfection, the main thing about social media is that everybody presents their perfect self
Yeah.
on social media, not themselves, their perfect self,
Right.
usually. And of course, if you're a passive user of social media and you're looking at what looks like all these people's absolutely perfect lives,
Yes.
and yours is miserable in comparison with all these perfect lives. And it's certainly true that if you're a passive user of social media, and you just update, your stuff, but you view other people's, you're much likely to more likely to feel disconnected rather than connected with those
Right.
people, and it affects as well it affects your self-image, and it also affects your self-esteem a lot because of that. And yeah, I mean, and I think there's a lot of evidence around now which seems to suggest that social media is something that has affected anxiety levels in a lot of young people because of these demands on them now.
But I think it's not even just young people. As someone who works in media, who's worked in media, you see it differently. You know that it's like how we used to take pictures. We used to take stills. You dress up for the picture, but we all knew that, in the real world, none of us dressed up in the way we did in pictures. And so I thought everybody had that kind of discernment. And so I was talking it over with my daughter, who said, of course, mommy, all you post is, if you're going to post an image of you in a golf course, but I said, how can anybody think you live on the golf course,
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, it's true. I mean, to be fair, there are people who do present their real life on things like Facebook. But I know a lot of the friends that I have on Facebook, they're only posting the things that they want other people to see, in terms of
But isn't
promoting.
that what it's there for? That, and maybe to share news that we want other people to be aware of. It's just, I think this brings the larger question of how should we be using social media? Because I'm very happy to film myself, doing dishes and talk to people and really more of my real life. But you feel like, do people really want that? Like, how should we be using social media?
Well, I wish I could answer that one. I mean, not even social media moguls themselves seem able to answer that or even address that issue, you know.
Yeah.
It clearly does have some benefits. And I think some of the benefits recently, well, certainly during the pandemic, for example, we've had people much more willing to reject and provide evidence against kind of conspiracy type theories about coronavirus, about the effects of having the jab and so on. And that's been really good. It's kind of hopefully put a lot of people right about what's right and wrong in this pandemic. Whereas social media was becoming fake news. You know, it becomes so popular in terms of spreading false facts, false news, and we've counteracted that a little bit now. So maybe there is a balance there somewhere.
Well, you say that, actually, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, was how a lot of the way we consume media now has caused huge shifts in our personal, like you hear all these things about how politics has split families, and now with the conspiracy theories and our reactions to COVID, that's done that not just on the collective level, but it's done it in intimate relationships. And I wanted to ask you about how, you know, how people, what is it in the psychology of some people that makes them susceptible to falling for conspiracy theories or this almost cult-like programming?
Yeah, I don't think we know particularly what makes people vulnerable to those kinds of things. I think one obvious factor in many cases is poor knowledge.
Right.
People, you know, I know people who don't have a particularly good education, and all of their knowledge of medicine comes from gossip that they have with friends, for example. So it's very difficult for a lot of people to actually know what a fact is, and very often difficult for people to verify a fact because they don't have the knowledge or education about how to find out whether something's true or false.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, and this is all human beings, I guess, here is that if we will have a self-image of us. We'll have an image of ourselves that we see ourselves as being this person. And what we know is that such people who have very strong beliefs about something which defines them as a person will pretty much only look for information that supports that belief and that definition. They don't go looking for evidence that is negative. And if they do, they're more likely to dismiss it. So, you know, that's how divisive politics starts in many ways.
Yeah. That's kind of what my intention was with setting up Ideology magazine, was I realized how widespread that problem is of how we see the world and how we define it. And for some people, they're not willing to entertain another person's point of view. And it brings me back to that. I don't know if you ever saw that viral thing that everyone's doing, where one person had Yanni and the other person had Laurel.
No, I haven't seen that.
Okay, so a while back, there was a sound that everyone would listen to, and it would say, so for some, they would hear the word Yanni, Y-A-N-N-Y, and others would hear the word Laurel, L-O-U-R-E-L. And it's so bizarre. You could clearly hear one or the other and not both. And even just within our family, we were split. And so it makes me wonder, is there something in our brain? Is it a physical part of how we think that we are unable to. We just don't have that ability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes.
Yeah, I think it's we do if we want to have that ability. I'm pretty sure, but for most people, they don't want the things that define them as a person. They don't want those challenged, because if they're challenged, you almost to yourself you become a non-person. You know, because if you can't say what defines me, you go, who am I? What am I? And so, in many ways, that's why people won't entertain beliefs from that contradict those beliefs that define them, because they don't want, if you like, themselves to be killed off. Because transforming yourself, changing your life, changing your beliefs and your self-image means changing things you do, the way you talk about things. It changes everything in your life.
This is really challenging, though, don't you think? Because now, more than ever, people have identities that they are constantly donning. So what does that then, how does that bode for the future? Because there are more and more labels being generated every day.
Yeah, well, I wish I knew, but I don't like that kind of progress. That's kind of crazy progress. We want a world that's more integrated, not divided by more labels.
Yeah.
To be sure.
Yeah, because I look back just when I'm 44 now, and in the 80s, you know, there was a universalism that we were taught. You know, the way we were taught history was, you know, that to believe in a teleological understanding of history, that we will constantly be integrating, and that humanity must come together. You must learn to see the other. But now there's an active movement against that very idea on every side.
Yeah. No, absolutely. When I was younger, it was all about communities integrating. It was about multiculturalism. It was about getting to understand other people in other countries. It was all about integration. And the European Union was a good example of that, which, you know, we now know is well, you know, we have Brexit, and you think, well, that's part of the falling apart of that kind of approach to the world that we had a few decades ago.
But what made it, that's the thing, what in our psychology has made us vulnerable to this new movement, so that collectively it almost feels like, or do you think that actually it's not the majority and it's a minority fringe that is being given huge microphones to make us believe that the movement against universalism, the movement against integration is louder?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that's a psychological thing. I think if you look back, that's a political and maybe even an economic thing, which goes in cycles. Maybe but I'm not an economist. I'm not a politician. Thank goodness.
What causes eating disorders? Is it very complicated and there's various causes of it?
Yeah, it's again, we have some knowledge of the risk factors for eating disorders, but we don't truly know what causes it. There are some genetic factors that have recently been discovered, but you know, again, they're not massively important. They're modest, those genetic factors. So something else is going on. Certainly, we know that people who develop eating disorders can be people who are affected by cultural norms in body shape, for example. and may often have body dissatisfaction
Right.
themselves. What that means is very much about how it's not that they may be overweight or obese, for example. It may be that they just have developed a view of themselves and their own body, which is very different to what other people see
Right.
in them. And certainly, body dissatisfaction is very much a risk factor.
Right.
For eating disorders, but there are other factors like perfectionism. If you're a perfectionist in everything you do, and if you're someone who's not tolerant of on any kind of uncertainty, you're more likely, for example, to develop an eating disorder and a very distorted view of your own body shape.
Yeah.
You will think that you are actually much your body is much bigger than it is in reality, for example.
How does anorexia then, how does that work?
Anorexia, again, there are a lot of theories that suggest that anorexia is when someone perceives that they have very little control in their life. And one thing they can control is what goes into their mouths and what they eat. That is the one thing they can control. And that fits in with some evidence which suggests that many young women who develop anorexia, for example, come from families where they've had domineering parents, usually a domineering father, that kind of thing. Now, again, that's just one theory.
Right.
And the theory is that basically the person that with anorexia will actually try to control their life by controlling their eating.
Yeah. And you mentioned the perfectionism. How does someone become a perfectionist? Is that parental influence?
Yeah, there's probably a fair input, parental input, or sort of social learning to perfectionism. Perfectionism again tends to be associated with anxiety in the sense that people are perfectionists because they are trying to make sure that bad things don't happen. And they're trying to reduce uncertainty in their lives, which might cause anxiety,
right,
for whatever reason. And again, we probably have to delve back into their individual's development to actually understand where that kind of thinking comes from.
right.